Your Free to Go is sponsored by Milburn Men's Clothing, where top athletes shop for sharp, tailored style. And whether Marc and I are in the studio or the courtroom, Milburn dresses us for success. Mention YFTG and get 10% off at Milburn Men's Clothing, which has been providing the finest in men's clothing and suits since 1946. Call 651-645-2922 or visit www.milburn.com.
Guy, we're excited to be here for our first episode.
Yeah, me too. We've been talking about this for a long time, Marc.
I know, and I thought we'd start off with one of your most famous cases, the infamous Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, everyone wants to know about that case.
That's right. So why don't you first tell us how you got involved in the case?
That's so cool because I was literally in the middle of a trial at the courthouse in West Palm Beach. That courthouse, as you know, because you've been there a million times like I have, is less than a mile from the very wealthy area of Palm Beach, right? So I get a call that I need to go over to his house immediately. I'd never met Jeff Epstein. I didn't know who he was at the time. But what happened is a search warrant was being served on his home on Palm Beach, which is an island, the Palm Beach Island, as they call it. And Jeff wasn't home. He was in New York. His house manager was there, and his house manager sees the police. They have a search warrant. He doesn't know what to do, so he calls his boss, Mr. Epstein, and he's, what do I do? Jeff Epstein calls his very close friend and kind of his advisor, the great Alan Dershowitz, who we all know is the youngest tenured professor at Harvard Law School, a brilliant, brilliant legal mind. And next thing you know, I'm getting a call, can you get over to his house? They're about to search his house with a search warrant. So I leave the trial, run over to the house on Palm Beach Island, start talking to the police. It was Palm Beach Police Department. And for them, this was a really big case because it's a small police agency, as you know. And they're typically more dealing with people driving through to look at all the fancy houses, the Billionaire Row in Palm Beach. And they're kind of there to keep traffic moving and make sure no one gets out of control and so forth. So this was a really big deal for them when they searched this. It was also a really big deal because the year before, the city had given, believe it or not, Jeff Epstein the key to the town.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. So that was a little
How
bit
ironic, huh?
yeah, it was ironic, and I think a donation was made to the town when he got that key, and I think that donation.
He bought the key?
Yeah, the donation was returned though.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that happened pretty quick after he got arrested. So that's really how I got in on the case.
So wait a second. You said you left the trial.
Yeah.
The trial had stopped, right?
Yeah, the trial.
You didn't just get up from the courtroom and run out.
Right. The jury had just gone out to start deliberating.
Oh, wow.
And the judge said, as they always do when the jury is deliberating, they tell the lawyers, meaning the prosecutor and the defense, to stay within an hour of the courthouse. Right. The bailiff sits outside the jury room. You and I have done this hundreds of times, but our listeners probably don't realize. The jurors go in their jury deliberating room. The bailiff sits outside the door because it's all confidential what goes on. And when they're ready, when the jury's ready, they bang on the door. The bailiff lets the judge know. The judge calls the lawyers and say, hey, get back to the courtroom.
That's always a nervous time.
Yeah, the nervous after you worked so hard on a case. So it was just, and I was lucky that it was during that timing that I was able to leave the courthouse and be 5 minutes away in case.
So what happened at the scene of the search?
Well, there were, believe it or not, at least 20. I think the entire police department, because that agency of Palm Beach probably only has 30 police officers in it to begin with. There were at least 20, if not 30 officers there. Partly because his home was so large, in Palm Beach. They did give me the opportunity to go in first and talk with the staff that was in the house, and I was able to look around at first and then read the search warrant and see exactly what they were searching.
What were they looking for?
They were looking for photographs, videos. They were looking for... specifically, the copy machine had a lot of documents on it that were, for those that you don't know, even though it was a very famous case, international attention and so forth, Jeff was accused of having sexual relations with minors. And the genesis of these was that young girls would come over to give him a massage. And the first massage was a traditional, law-abiding massage. They would be paid for it. If Jeff enjoyed that massage, he would invite them back. And typically on the second visit, it would become a little more sexual in nature. So all these girls, when they first came over, had to provide an ID to show that they were of age. Of course, we learned after the fact that they were fake IDs. So that's what they were looking at the copy machine for, was to see if there were any copies of these fake IDs that the house staff were making pictures of every time a girl would come over to give him a massage. They were looking for any type of lists of customers of his, or I guess massage therapists of his, any of the girls' names and so forth. So they took a lot of photographs out of the house. They took a lot of documents out of the house. They
So
took
then what happened afterwards?
So Jeff obviously eventually was arrested.
Right. What was he charged with?
Sexual battery at first, which, that's the legal term that we all refer to, but the common, layman term is rape.
Right.
And added to that on a minor.
Right.
So someone under 18 years old. And there were a number of counts because he was accused of a pattern of having lots of young girls come over and give him massages that would become sexual. And it was a very, very serious case. I was in, as I just said, from the very beginning, and was able to, over a period of about a year and a half, work out a deal with the government that satisfied every victim in the case. And he was actually going to plea and not be convicted to a crime called battery on a child, which is actually not a sex offense, and he was going to be placed on probation.
So let me ask you this. I'm sure our listeners are curious about this. Here you have a client who's accused, and there seems to be substantial proof of him having sex with minors, and he's charged with rape or crimes that amount to a rape. How do you feel about representing somebody like that? Why do you represent somebody like that?
If we had $1 for every time we were asked that question, I think we would have been retired 20 years ago. Yeah. So, every case is different, but there's a lot of reasons or a lot of answers I can give you for that question. One is the typical that there's a U.S. Constitution, and it's our honor to make sure that the Constitution is upheld by law enforcement. In other words, the police have to dot their I's and cross their T's, and if they don't, then we have to hold them accountable for that. Because if they make a mistake, even though your client might be guilty, and as a result of them making a mistake, your client gets released or the charges get dropped, we're holding them accountable for that mistake, which means they won't make that mistake against other people who are possibly innocent.
That's the key, isn't it?
It is the key.
You protect the innocent by serving the guilty.
100%. And you know what? A lot of people, when they ask that question, they're actually offended when they hear what we do for a living, or for, my experience has been, people will say, I can't believe you would represent Jeff Epstein. He was literally raping these underage girls. And then when we really start talking about it, and I explain it to them, and then, God forbid, someone in their family gets in trouble, or they get in trouble, or falsely accused of something.
They call you and they expect you to defend them as vigorously.
Right, and that's when they realize, now I get what you do for a living.
Right.
And there's other things too. I remember a case when I was a prosecutor. This young woman who had a young baby was arrested for shoplifting. She was shoplifting baby formula. Now, did that lady need to go to prison or jail? No, of course not. She couldn't afford to feed her baby. She needed to learn how to apply for a job. She needed to learn how to write a resume, things like that. She didn't need to go to jail. So sometimes our role is to make sure that the punishment fits the crime. So, in the initial resolution that I negotiated and was actually signed off on by all parties for Jeff Epstein, they were getting treatment provided to them, psychological treatment. They were getting help with paying college tuition, or if they needed a car to get to work, they were getting help for that. There were funds set up for them so that they would never have to worry again in their life. And they were comfortable with what had happened. And
well, that seems to be the part of the case that most people don't know about, because then somehow after that, the whole thing exploded and blew up. So what happened then? Yeah,
it really did. And by the way, there's one other thing I like to say about when people ask me about how we can represent guilty people or people accused of a heinous crime like Jeff Epstein was. There's actually a dozen or 20 things I like to say, but one that I really find hits home with a lot of people is I make an analogy to a emergency room doctor. That when someone comes in on a gurney into the emergency room and they're being told, the doctor said, hey, we have to operate on this guy or he's going to die. Immediately, emergency operation. And that doctor finds out that person just shot and killed 2 officers, and they shot him back and hit him, and that's why he needs his surgery, and he needs to save this guy's life. He has the obligation to do so. You don't think we're guilty, not guilty. And it's our obligation to defend someone. Our Constitution gives everyone the right to a defense. You have a right to defend yourself.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal that the next time I'm asked.
Yeah, my pleasure. Just give me credit, though. All right, give me credit. But no, back to your question, where it all went wrong. So, unfortunately, it did go wrong. And Jeff Epstein was a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. There wasn't an area that he didn't know inside and out.
He had two sides to him. He was evil on one hand and brilliant. How was he like to deal with?
The guy was so charismatic. I would walk down the streets with him in New York on Madison Avenue, and people would see him out the window, and they'd come out to say hello. How are you? What's going on, Jeff? How's the family? He wasn't married with children, but he had family through his brother and his family and so forth. Where are you going? What's up? People loved him. So charismatic beyond belief. Brilliant like you've never known. So I'll give you an example. One day I'm talking and I said my daughter, who at the time was maybe 12 or 13 years old, was doing some theater. She was really getting involved in acting. And off the top of his head, he started quoting and citing these studies about the development of the brain and with children who like to go work in the theater and who like acting. And he started telling me, Guy, write this study down, write this down. I started writing stuff down. I went back and researched it later. He was spot on. Later that day, he's literally on the phone with, I mentioned earlier, Alan Dershowitz, talking at the highest level in the world about appellate law, cases that the Supreme Court ruled on, 70 years ago, and challenging, or Stephen Hawking, the world's most prominent, may he rest in peace, physicist and so forth. He's literally challenging him. He said something to him and he said, Jeff, I've never even thought of that concept. I'm going to research that and get back to you. So the guy was brilliant on any topic you presented to him. Genius beyond belief. Personable, very nice, supportive, but he had a dark side.
Wow.
He just enjoyed
we've discovered that in representing our clients. It's interesting. It's often said in our business that criminal lawyers see the worst people at their best, and divorce lawyers see the best people at their worst.
Right. There's a great judge. Her name was Judge Broom. She presided over the William Kenny Smith trial, if I remember correctly, back in 90 or so. She said that she was on criminal for a long time, which the William Kenny Smith was a criminal trial, as we all know. She said she got tons of death threats as a judge on the family court, and she never got a death threat on the criminal court because she saw those clients in family court at their worst.
Yeah, well, we also know, sadly, about divorce attorneys who get shot and killed during depositions.
That's right. Yeah, it does happen.
From, the spouses.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It is horrible.
But
so back to your question.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I never answered that. Okay, so where it went wrong, all the victims had signed off on it, and actually the federal prosecutor, Acosta, the U.S. attorney in South Florida at the time, was investigating, and he was going to bring some federal charges. And in the discussions with him, he realized that the state attorney's office in Palm Beach County was going to be punishing Jeff, and it was going to be a serious punishment. So he dropped his federal investigation, closed that case down, and just relied on Palm Beach County to impose the appropriate sentence on Jeff. I negotiated, nevertheless, a sentence that didn't require any jail time, didn't require a felony conviction or sexual battery conviction, but I had all the victims happy with it. And there was one condition on that Jeff didn't like. It was that he always, while on probation, he was always going to have an adult with him who was aware of the charges. So basically, they wanted a third party with him at all time to make sure he didn't misbehave. A chaperone.
Huh.
So I said to Jeff, you have a bodyguard, security guard with you all the time, or you have your home, you have a house manager. Shouldn't be an issue. You go on a dinner and a movie, you have a driver. Just have the driver at the table next to you. He's an adult. He knows about this case. But he didn't really, and there was a second issue. Jeff had his own plane. He had several planes. And
I heard that plane was black.
Yes, that was a whole nother issue. I did not like flying on that plane.
Tell me why.
Well, I've been fortunate to fly on, as they say, PJs. That's what the young kids say nowadays, the PJ, the private jet. I've been fortunate for many years to fly private jets, and they're always white. And there's a reason they're white. It's because the runways are typically black. So when you're landing on a runway, if there's another plane coming in behind you, they can see that they're coming in on top of another plane. Jeff always wanted to have a really cool looking black airplane. So his personal plane that he flew around on the most was painted black. He thought that
Really?
looked
Wow.
hot. But the problem with that, I always told him I wasn't comfortable going on it because any plane coming in behind him for a landing could mistake his plane for the runway.
Oh, boy.
So that was not very comfortable. So where were we? So Jeff, the deal was really good. The second thing he didn't like was he had to travel. He likes to travel all the time. That's when you're a billionaire, that's what you do. He said, Guy, and the condition was he had to have an adult with him at all times, and he always had to get permission from probation to travel. And I told him, all you have to do is email them or call them. They're not allowed to deny it unless it's totally an unreasonable request, and which it won't be. So you'll be allowed. But he said, Guys, sometimes I could get a call and say, hey, come over to London today. We're having a party tonight. And I just go straight from my office, fire up the plane, and I'm gone. I don't want to have to ask probation. So we literally had already signed the deal. We just hadn't been in court to enter it yet. And the next thing I know, another local attorney met with Jeff and told him, don't worry, I can take care of this. I know the state attorney, the elected state attorney. At the time, it was Barry Krischer, who you know. He was there for 20 years. He was my boss when I was a prosecutor in 92 for 4 years. Actually, my first 4 years was David Bloodworth, who you remember. He was there 20 years also. And then Barry Krischer took over for the second 2 years of my term. And so we went to the prosecutor, and this is the deal they wanted. But Jeff Epstein talked to some other prosecutor, some other criminal defense lawyer, who said, "Oh, I know the prosecutor really well," referring to Barry Krischer, "and I'll get him to drop those two conditions about having a chaperone and that you don't have to get permission."
Well, did they get dropped?
No, in fact, it got worse. What happened?
The deal never got made?
Correct. The deal never was presented to the judge, even though it had been signed off by me, Jeff,
Wow.
and the prosecutor. What happened? It got worse. They were so upset that this new lawyer came into the picture and tried to pull favoritism that they ignored him. They didn't call. Barry Krischer didn't call him back. He didn't, and he's, "Oh, we're gonna meet for coffee." Barry Krischer didn't meet him for coffee. So after about 2 weeks of that, everyone was really panicked. Jeff was panicked. He was concerned. Asked me to, get back involved, see what we can do. So I called the prosecutor, who made it clear to me they were so offended by this deal that he tried to pull with this friend, so to speak, of Barry Krischer, and that they weren't going to play those games. And so they were so upset about it, they had sent out subpoenas to present to the grand jury 7 counts of sexual battery on minors. And I said, well, can we pull those back? They said, no, they've already been sent. So they were so upset, even by this move, that this attorney tried to convince Jeff that he could get an even better deal just on those 2 issues. It was already the deal of the century, and the victims were happy with it. But they went ahead, and Jeff was one thing when you asked me to describe him, he was also very litigious. He wasn't.
Oh, I know that, and I'll tell you a story later about that.
Yeah, I'm sure we can go on for days. I'm sure on this case and many others. So Jeff would fight everything. He was always a fighter. He would never go down without a fight. And so he had talked to this attorney who screwed everything up. I find out about the subpoena for the grand jury, and they're going forward with at least 7 counts of sexual battery on a minor. So I go back to the prosecutor and to Barry Krischer, and I say, look, we had this worked out. I'm sorry this guy came in. It wasn't really planned that way. It just happened. Let's rehabilitate this situation. They asked me what I had in mind, so I came up with an idea that really is unprecedented, as you know. I said, well, you let me speak to the grand jury. And, I reference Alan Dershowitz. He has that famous saying, a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich.
Or a postage stamp.
Right. Now, for those of you that don't know, the reason they'll indict a ham sandwich is because a grand jury only hears evidence from the prosecutor. A prosecutor presents evidence of a crime and allegations, and all the states and government's witnesses testify, but the grand jury never hears anything from the defense. So of course they're going to agree. They don't hear the contrary side of the story, so they indict every time.
Well, actually, I have an interesting story about that. When I was a DA in New York, we had a potential case against a public official, and my office felt that it was not a good case, but they felt politically they had to present it.
Sure.
So I was told to present it to the grand jury, but I was told to give obviously a very balanced view and put on the defense side. And obviously, the intent, I think, of the DA's office was for the grand jury not to return a true bill, meaning an indictment, but they indicted.
They did. Of course they did. They always do.
Because they always do.
They always do, right? So, I mean, and you never hear about a defense presentation because that's not allowed in the rules.
Right.
But believe it or not, the office allowed me. They said, well, we're not going to, come on, let's not push it. We're not going to let you appear before the grand jury and present all your evidence as to why they shouldn't indict. But they said, we'll let you present like a argument as from a defense perspective, a defense argument. You can present it to us and we will present it to the grand jury on your behalf. And sure enough, they did. And then they came back with just like 1 count or 2 counts, I forget what it was, of, sexual battery on a minor, And so then that case was able to go forward. And then we resolved that very favorably, though. He wound up getting a year in jail. But on that year, he was able to have work release.
Right.
And that work release was pretty benign, to be honest with you. He was able to leave at, like 7 a.m, be back by 6 p.m. And he basically would sit either at first in his home, and then a lot of times at an office in Palm Beach.
Well, a lot of people obviously felt, and certainly later on, that he got off basically scot-free.
Yeah.
You obviously did an excellent job, but then the federal government got involved.
It got worse.
And then it got worse. And then ultimately, we all know kind of what happened.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know you got involved at one point, so I'm probably about 2 seconds away from that.
But I want to ask you a very important question.
Yes.
Before we finish anything about Jeff Epstein, because I'm sure this is on everybody's mind. What do you think about what really ultimately happened? Was it suicide or was it something else?
So, of course, I wasn't there, but I know Jeff very, very well. I know this case inside and out better than anyone because I'm the only lawyer that was on it from day one until the day he passed away. In fact, at some points we had probably a total over the time of 50 lawyers on this case.
Right.
What would happen is an issue would come up, a very interesting issue, and Jeff would say to me, Guy, who's the world best on this legal issue?
He had all the money in the world,
yeah,
right?
You're a billionaire and you can spend as much as you need to on a defense. As I mentioned earlier, he was very litigious. He never gave up. Which is why I know he didn't kill himself, by the way, because that would have been giving up. But he would say, Guy, get this lawyer. Whoever the best is for this issue, I want to hire him. And we would. So at one point or another, we had at least 50 different lawyers from beginning and end on this case. But no one knows it better than I do because I was on it from the entire time.
You felt that
he did not kill himself.
And we both know
Right.
a lawyer we won't name,
Right, who we worked
was
with.
representing
Yeah.
that we worked with,
Yeah.
who got a call from him like the day before, and they were talking about negotiating further the contract for the lawyer.
Yeah.
And it just didn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make
that
sense
he
that you'd be
kills
negotiating.
himself the next day if he's now talking to the lawyer about how much he's going to be paying him in the future, unless our friend quoted them too much.
And that killed him.
But we doubt
here's-
that.
Right. So here's why I know he didn't kill himself. I don't know who killed him, by the way, but it had to be someone with a lot of power. But there's a bunch of reasons. Number one, Jeff would never roll over or give up, ever. He never, ever would give up. He would fight, fight, fight. Number two, he believed, this may sound crazy, but he believed he was innocent.
Mm-hmm.
He never believed that he would be convicted of anything.
Mm-hmm.
He believed he was very good to these girls, that these girls really genuinely cared about him because they knew he genuinely cared about them, and that he would never get convicted. The government said that he was, the defense asked to move him out of suicide watch, but that never happened. There was never a request to move him out of suicide watch. And by moving him out of suicide watch, it was easier to get to him. There's also issues of the cameras. The cameras, we know we've been in a million jails, in and out of jails. Fortunately, we're allowed to walk out whenever we want. But anyway, there were cameras and they weren't working. That's another thing that doesn't make sense. There were 2 guards on his jail cell that weren't there. They had been relocated. No one can explain why they weren't there. And he had a cellmate when he first got moved into this area, and that cellmate had been relocated, and there's no explanation for why. And the final most important factor, I have unwavering respect for Dr. Michael Baden, the world-renowned, most prominent forensic pathologist ever. He's done every major, death case there is as a forensic pathologist doing the autopsies, as you know. And he examined Jeff's body and said there is no way in this world that he hanged himself. It's impossible. It absolutely did not happen. So for all those reasons and just my gut instinct of knowing him as well as I do, there was no way. Oh, and by the way, he felt he was going to get out. He was held on a bond, they said, with no bond, because they said he was a flight risk. But when he flew into Teterboro on his private plane, he knew that he was under investigation, going to be arrested imminently. So at some point he knew.
I guess, you probably know better than anybody else, being right there. And I guess we'll just never know, but
won't know who did it.
We'll never know what happened at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Some people say justice was served in the end.
Well,
but
before I ask you about your connection to Jeff Epstein's case, just to wrap the bow on this, because I talked about how that was resolved very favorably, really. Then it blew up. The victims, the young girls, their parents found out about this, and they started hiring civil lawyers. Now, we know the difference between civil and criminal. Criminal's about your freedom, civil's about money.
Right.
So the parents of these young girls said, oh, let's hire these civil lawyers, and they started suing for money. They found out that the feds had dropped their case, and they said that wasn't right. They kind of you got tricked into this. You never should have dropped that case. And for, I believe it was about 10 years, they fought in the courts because the defense for Epstein said, no, you already dropped this. You can't reopen it. Ultimately, the appellate court ruled that the feds could reopen the case, and that was when he got charged, flying into Teterboro, knowing he was going to get arrested on the federal case, and he was arrested, and that was the case he was in jail on.
Well, the civil case is talking about the civil cases, is the connection of how I got involved on the other side of Jeff Epstein.
You're Free to Go is sponsored by Lang Realty, South Florida's premier residential real estate broker. Whether you're buying, selling, or renting a home or condo, Lang's experienced realtors are standing by ready to help you. Contact one of Lang's top realtors today at 561-703-2427.
I was representing, I was a member first of the firm of Rothstein, Rosenfeld, and Adler. Yep. Scott Rothstein, the infamous Ponzi schemer in South Florida, the largest Ponzi scheme in Florida history, and I think the fourth or fifth largest Ponzi ever in the U.S.
Which was shortly after Madoff, which we'll talk about that another day, because I was very involved in the Madoff case. Madoff hits everybody, then your client, Rothstein, hits everybody.
So Rothstein, when the firm was active before he got discovered as the Ponzi schemer, had hired some lawyers, and one of those lawyers, a very good lawyer, was representing a number of the victims of Epstein and was actually very, very vigorously prosecuting those cases. So when Rothstein's Ponzi scheme came to light, and the basic engine of the Ponzi scheme was that he was creating fictitious cases, civil cases, Epstein turned around and sued Rothstein and sued that lawyer individually, claiming that those cases that they were representing against Epstein were actually fictitious, made up by Rothstein, which of course really wasn't true.
Which ties into the airplane that I talked about earlier, that beautiful black plane that he personally used the most. My understanding was at the time was that there were flight manifests. A flight manifest shows who the pilots are on that date, the passengers are, and where they're flying from and to, and the time and so forth.
Right.
And that there would be names of adult passengers that you could see, and many of those names, besides Jeff's, were famous people. And then there'd be one or two or maybe three names that were blacked out, and that those names, my understanding from our side of the case was that Scott Rothstein got a hold of these flight manifests and was going to clients, were going, I guess, to lenders and saying, hey, we represent these two or three blacked out names. They're minors. They've hired us. We're going to sue, and we're going to make a lot of money, but these girls need some money up front. So if you lend us some money, we'll pay them off, and you can own the lawsuit.
Well, I can tell you, having been very, very much involved with Scott Rothstein's case as a lawyer, that's one of the few things he didn't do.
Really?
So what happened is Epstein sues Rothstein. I'm representing Rothstein in the criminal Ponzi case. And Epstein's case is going on. By then, Rothstein is already in the federal witness protection program prison. And I think he may have already been sentenced. And at that point, we figured there was no reason to go after Scott. The case against the other lawyer actually turned around. I believe what happened is that case got dismissed and the lawyer countersued Epstein and won against Epstein.
Right.
But Epstein's case against Scott kept going on, kept going on. I kept calling the lawyer and said, why don't you dismiss it? There's no reason to pursue it. But they never did. So finally I got to the point. I said, you know what? I'm going to take Jeff Epstein's deposition.
Yep.
So I called the lawyer. I said, give me some dates. And we were going to gear up. I figured I'm going to have a hell of a good time taking Jeff Epstein's deposition.
Right. And he was already in jail at that time, right?
He was already in jail.
Yeah, I thought
so what happened is, as we were getting things set up, lo and behold, he dies.
He dies.
But, you know, that was the connection between Rothstein and Epstein.
Right. Yeah, it's funny how that played out that way, right? For the two of us
So
especially.
the way the Rothstein case began.
Yep. How did you, I kind of know, but I think our audience would love to know how you got involved on that case.
Well, as I said, I've been a member of Rothstein, Rosenfeld, and Adler. I ran the white-collar division. We had a bunch of lawyers, and unbeknownst to almost everybody in that firm, as it ultimately became proven, Scott was running a Ponzi scheme on the side. And at first it was, you know, rich people investing in these fictitious cases. Then it became super rich, and then it became hedge funds. And ultimately what happened is, I remember the day, the night in particular, I was in my office, I was packing up, it was a Friday night. I was going to be flying to Switzerland the next day to negotiate the return of $10 or $20 million, I forget the amount, but something like that, to a client, a Venezuelan client. And I get called by one of the other partners in the firm to come down to his office, and he sounded very worried. So I went down to the office, I knocked on the door was closed, which typically his door was not, and I hear voices in the background. I open the door, and there are a couple of other senior people in the firm, and they look like someone had died.
Right. And
So what's going on?
this was a big firm, right? By that point?
At that point, we had like 80-something, 90 lawyers,
Right.
former judges,
Right,
a
well,
lot of great lawyers.
Prominent South Florida law firm.
Scott had become the 800-pound gorilla in South Florida. He was even listed in the 50 most prominent people in Broward County.
Right.
And the Broward County Theater of Performing Arts, the curtain had the name Rothstein, Rosenfeld, and Adler, which is a bit of embarrassment
Right.
when you're sitting inside.
And like judges and officers, elected officials, all joined that firm, right?
He was the big guy.
Yeah.
So what happened is, I said, what happened? And they said, Scott's disappeared with $1 billion in trust.
Oh, man.
And it just didn't make sense because we weren't a mergers and acquisition firm. We weren't a real estate firm. We didn't have that kind of money. I didn't know what was in the bank account because I didn't have access to it. It just didn't make sense. And I said, I don't know what you guys are talking about. We talked for a while. And then I went upstairs. I was a bit troubled. And then my phone rings. And it's got a whole bunch of numbers on it. Clearly an international call. And who gets on the phone? Scott Rothstein. I said, Scott, what the hell's going on?
Well, let me ask you something. At that moment, are you worried about maybe the law enforcement listening to this phone call?
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a shock. And then I said, Scott, what the hell's going on? He said, I can't talk to you unless you promise to represent me, and you're going to have to leave the firm.
Yep.
And I said, all right, well, what's happening? Said he was in Morocco. And by the way, everything I'm saying here has become public record by now.
Yeah, well, that's
None
the
of
thing
this-
about most of our cases that are
Yeah,
they're
this
high
is
profile and they're
public record.
Right.
Everybody knows this.
if someone
The
wants to
government
spend the
knows this.
hours digging through the
Yeah.
documents, they're going to come across
Right.
this. But
So what happened is, I said, all right, well, what happened? He started telling me, he's in Morocco. There's billions of dollars involved. And it was a Ponzi scheme. And it was like a hurricane hit me. And he said, will you represent me? And I immediately said yes. People have always asked me why.
right.
You know, and as a criminal lawyer, this was the Everest of criminal cases. And if you're a climber, you want to climb Everest, right?
That's right.
Well, I'm a lawyer. I wanted the Everest of cases. I didn't even bat an eye. I said, sure. We didn't even talk money. We didn't talk about anything other than, I said, but you know what? And I can't. He said, I want to negotiate with the government. I said, well, they're not going to negotiate with you unless you come back. They don't negotiate with fugitives. So that weekend, I called the acting U.S. attorney. I had his cell number, and we arranged for Scott to come back on Tuesday. And somehow over that weekend, the media learned that I was going to be representing Scott. To this day, I don't know, but the
We know
reality
there's
is
leaks everywhere.
leaks.
Always.
It's like a sieve.
Every case, every
Every
police,
case.
state attorney's office, DA's office, whoever it is, they all leak
There's
everything.
leaks everywhere. So by Tuesday, there were news trucks outside my house in Fort Lauderdale. And now I've got to go meet Scott, who's flying in on a private plane at the Fort Lauderdale airport. And he's going to be met by agents and prosecutors. But I don't want to let anybody know. And there was even some talk in the media about that Scott's going to be returning. I don't know how they found that out. Again, leaks. So I led the news trucks on a wild goose chase. I went to the Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport on commercial via Hialeah.
Wow, yeah. Yeah.
You know, I wasn't that adept at losing tails.
Right. So for those of us listeners that don't know this geographic area, that's going south and west.
South about 20-something
Right.
miles.
The exact opposite
I
direction.
burned the whole tank of gas,
Right.
probably.
Going to
In
the-
any event, we got to the airport, picked up Scott. They let him come into my car. We drove right to the U.S. Attorney's office, and that night we began the process of him debriefing, explaining what he had done. And as it turns out, ultimately, it wasn't just a Ponzi scheme. He was laundering money for the mob. He was buying off the police. He was buying off local judges. He was a full-service guy.
Well, there was so much going on there that this is going to take over your entire practice. And what's interesting to me, there's a million tentacles to this that I want to hear about and talk about, and I'm sure everyone else wants to hear about. But as a lawyer who makes a living off of people paying us a representation fee, what caught my attention was when you said you got that phone call and you just said yes. You hadn't even talked about a fee, and this case is going to be a monster case. And you and I both know that we cannot be paid with ill-gotten gains, which means if funds come from an illegal criminal enterprise, those funds cannot be used to pay us our fee. So at that moment in time, you're thinking, I'm getting myself involved in a monster case, the Everest of cases, and I may never even get paid for this.
Well, it's crazy because typically, obviously, since we are business people, we've got to make a living. We've got to earn on each case. Typically, up front, the first thing you discuss is a fee, and you get that nailed down, especially in a criminal case, federal case, because judges don't let you out if you don't get paid. So we got to get our money up front. Somehow, and I look back at this laughing, I don't think we talked fee for a couple of days.
Wow. Well,
And of course, by then, it was pretty clear he wasn't going to be able to pay me.
Right.
How am I going to get paid? Everything he's got, even if it wasn't from ill-gotten gains, is going to wind up ultimately getting seized.
Wasn't there a point where the court stepped in and said, you know, put a lot of time in this, you need to get some type of compensation?
Yeah, but it didn't happen that way. In fact, the only thing that happened with the court that was good, you know, all the lawyers at Rothstein, Roosevelt, and Adler immediately came under suspicion
Sure.
of knowing about the Ponzi scheme. Luckily for me, by representing him, the first thing the government had to do was address the issue of whether or not I had a conflict of interest. Because if they had evidence or believed that I was involved, I couldn't represent them.
That's right. Yeah.
Luckily, I mean, what happened is because of representing him, the government did their investigation, determined, rightfully, that I had no knowledge of it. So I got a public clearing within a week or two of the case.
You know, which is not unusual for a Ponzi scheme, where that the person that's leading the scheme keeps the people in the know very, very small. Madoff only had 2 or 3 people that knew about it, went on for 20 plus years. You know, if the more people that know about it, the more likely it's going to be discovered and be leaked, as we talked about earlier, things leaking. So Scott was classic Ponzi schemer, where just he and maybe 1 or 2 other people were aware of it at all. No,
now, I understand that you knew him from another experience,
yes,
right? Tell us about that.
It's ironic, but I give Scott a lot of credit for the career I've had, which I'm very blessed and appreciative, because it's been a great career. I was in law school at the time, and I knew I wanted to be a litigator, and I knew I wanted to do criminal law. So I took a trial advocacy class, and he was the teacher. And you and I have both done a lot of teaching, and we know the influence a teacher can have and the challenges you have when you teach students. And sometimes you're trying to get through to a student and you just see the light bulbs not going off on them. So he gave the class an assignment to come in preparing with a prepared opening argument. And he gave us some facts. We're going to argue this case. So Scott Rothstein's the professor, and this is my, you know, I'm getting to know him as a professor. I thought he was brilliant, smart, quick on his feet, bigger than life figure, actually. And I get there, I work all night on this opening. I think it's just perfection beyond. And I get in front of the podium, in front of the whole class. He's standing at the back of the room, and I just start delivering this incredible opening statement for this trial of these fake facts that he gave us. And I finish, and I'm ready to say thank you and sit down, and he runs up to the podium. He grabs my notebook, and he throws it in the garbage. He says, "That was horrible. Do it again." I then gave the entire opening statement again without one note, and it was the best thing I ever did.
Wow. Well, ironically, you were his student. He was my student.
So you taught him.
I taught him he was in the section, a joint section that we all taught in, and I was a trial advocacy professor, and I thought he was a very bright guy, very bright kid at the time, a little over the top, as it turns out, was the case. So anyway, getting back to the representation of Scott, what happened is immediately it exploded in the media. In fact, I always joke that should have been a section in the Sun Sentinel, officially the Rothstein section, because every day there was a story.
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
And it was on the news every night. And
well, it's also like, because you referenced earlier about how his name was at the theater, but if you went to the football stadium, his name was on the tickets.
Oh, it was crazy.
You couldn't go at the popular restaurants. He was the owner.
And so his fall was what they call a Schadenfreude festival, which is the German term for people taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. Because like everybody else who goes up, on their way up, they tick off a lot of people.
Yes.
So a lot of those people were happy to see him go down. So what happened is, I have him cooperating with the government, but in order to cooperate with the government and help them make cases against other people involved, or other investigations they thought he could be useful in, the people out there that they were investigating couldn't know that he was cooperating. But the media was reporting that he's cooperating.
Right, I saw it in the news.
Right?
Yeah.
Every day. And I had to dispel that. So I was holding news conferences saying that I have him hidden from the government. Why anybody would believe that
Right.
is another story. But what happened is we would go every day they would take him, or every other day, to a different deserted motel, that didn't have much business around Fort Lauderdale, and we'd sit outside on the tables. There'd be nobody else around with the agents and the prosecutors going through everything that went on, what we call debriefing.
Did they let him smoke his cigars? 'Cause I know he loved his
actually,
cigars.
we smoked cigars
Yeah.
sometimes. But what happened is there was a guy who ran a blog, Bob Norman. At the time, there were blogs where, this is before
everyone
all
followed
the social media.
And everyone
we
followed
have
his
now,
blog.
right?
Everybody.
And of course, he was dissing Rothstein naturally, and me too, and he was talking about cooperation. So we decided to use Bob Norman, since he was getting the word out. Very popular guy, very bright guy. To use him to serve our purposes by the cooperation. So what we did was, one day we had somebody leak to Norman that Scott and I were going to be at the Capitol Grill at the Galleria Mall in Fort Lauderdale at a certain time. And then he was in the agent's custody, brought him to a gas station. I picked him up in my car. We went to the Capitol Grill. We sat at the bar. We're talking, we're drinking. And of course, what happens? Bob Norman comes in, goes to the other side of the bar, is surreptitiously, it wasn't that surreptitiously, videoing us at the bar. And so this is great. And at some point, he comes up and he says, "How you guys doing?" And, I said, "Well, listen, I got Scott. I don't want anybody to know we're here. Come on, help us out." Well, it got reported that we were out.
That's right.
So it served the purpose of people believing that he wasn't cooperating or in the government custody.
I remember seeing that picture in the newspaper, actually.
Yeah, so what happened is they used Scott to work a sting operation with the person who was alleged to be the connection between the Sicilian mob and the local mob. And Scott set him up in a money laundering sting operation. The guy got arrested. So,
well, I think there's so much we can talk for days on both this case and, of course, Jeff Epstein's case.
Right.
We may have to, if our listeners want it, we'll give them more.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's a lot more. That case went sideways at one point. I would love to hear, before we wrap up, like how you represent someone that, the public calls it a snitch. We call it a cooperation agreement or flipping. How you feel about that, how the case wound up, and so forth.
Well, I'll tell you very quickly, as a trial lawyer, I much prefer to fight the government. I much prefer to go to trial. But any lawyer who says that they don't represent people who cooperate is either a liar, in my judgment, or doesn't have any business. Because your first obligation is do what's in your client's best interest.
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of times, it's to cooperate with the government, especially if they have the goods on your client. I personally am not having fun. I've always likened it to being a eunuch at an orgy.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you got to do what's in your client's best interest.
Right.
Unfortunately, with Scott, we had a deal that was going to wind up shaving off a significant part of his sentence, because he was useful in about 27 or 29 people being successfully prosecuted. But the government claimed that he hid jewelry with his wife and that he lied about something, and they ripped up the agreement. I appealed that. I actually took it to the Supreme Court, but they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day,
his cooperation was out the window.
Out the
and he didn't
window.
get the discount or reduction
So,
in sentence.
the lesson is, if you're going to cooperate, you can't be halfway pregnant.
That's right.
If you're going to cooperate, you got to be truthful the whole way. And that's about that.
The side note, too, is the jewelry that his wife, that he said had been sold, his wife had, she sold with the assistance of a lawyer, and they both got prosecuted. His wife
As well as the women that helped them.
Right. It was a whole
And why
what a
they
mess.
sold it at a local jeweler instead of all the way around, halfway around the world, defies explanation.
So
But-
we'll discuss this more probably in future episodes, I imagine, because we have a lot more.
Well, we've got our next episode that's going to be coming up that's going to be very exciting, because we're going to be talking about some of our crazy-ass cases.
Yes. They're all crazy, let's be honest,
Yeah,
but some are more crazy than others.
You have some crazy ones. I have a case that I haven't yet found anybody else who's done this. Maybe it is, but I doubt it. It's a case in which I was not only the lawyer representing the client, I was also named as the victim in the charge.
Oh, that's
and the judge allowed me to continue with the case, and we'll tell our listeners about that. And I know you have something.
Well, it's hard to pick. We have so many crazy. But the one I think I'll share in our next episode is, I'll just say this, the prostitute who drove around with a dead body in her car.
Oh, wow. That's
Stay
exciting.
tuned for the prostitute with the dead body in her car.
So anyway, folks,
thanks for being with us today.
Excited about our next episode. And until then, you're
free to go. Down Low Investigations is a sponsor of You're Free to Go. Behind every great criminal defense attorney is a great private investigator. That's why Marc and I use Down Low to investigate cases all over the country. Down Low can help you too, whether you're running a background check on an employee or running a background check on a blind date, or let's say you need someone followed or some other type of investigative work conducted. Down Low is the way to go. Call Download Investigations at 561-843-1806. Everything expressed and discussed in this episode are the opinions and experiences of attorneys Guy Fronstin and Marc Nurik and their guests. All ethical rules are complied with. Attorney-client privilege and confidential information is not shared or released during these episodes, and names, dates, locations, and other identifying information may be changed to protect confidentiality. Topics are embellished, and none of the statements made constitute legal advice and should not be considered or relied on as such.